Hey everyone, welcome to Time Sensitive. This week, Spencer's in conversation with the poet and writer Saeed Jones. His latest book is the poetry collection Alive at the End of the World. Saeed's debut collection, Prelude to Bruise, was a 2014 National Book Critics Circle Award finalist. And his second book, the memoir How We Fight for Our Lives, won the 2019 Kirkus Prize for Nonfiction. What did you guys talk about?
So we talked a lot about grief and the grieving process, issues of race, sexuality, power, all subjects at the heart of his new book, and all of his books, I should say.
Sounds a bit heavy.
It does, but actually there's this quality to Saeed that puts you at ease, and it's the same effect when you read his books. Like, as is clear on this episode, he laughs a lot.
He's a very jovial character when he was in the studio.
And yet there's this blunt, let's not beat around the bush quality to his work. He intentionally and directly addresses so many of these like harsh, gut-punching realities that we would rather ignore. And he does it in this open way that sometimes is actually just downright hilarious.
Yeah, he's a very comedic kind of spirit.
Yeah, I mean, he actually talks a little bit about Richard Pryor and Diane Carroll and these larger-than-life cultural icons who have influenced him. And he told me that he lives to wallow, which in his case is not actually a bad or a sad thing. He gets to these higher truths and finds meaningful connection points by wading through this tough stuff slowly, thoughtfully, and with good humor.
Right. Wallow with comedy.
Mm-hmm.
I can't wait to hear it. But before we get into it, we first like to thank our Season 6 sponsor, L'École School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison Van Cleef and Arpels. Celebrating its first decade this year, L'École, which has permanent campuses in both Paris and Hong Kong, plans to open a third space in Shanghai next year. This year, they're also opening a second space in Paris, which will feature a public library of more than 7,000 reference works on jewelry and gems. And at its main Paris space, L'École is also opening a gemothèque, or gem library, with 1,200 stones for visitors to view and even touch. Both spaces will also host exhibitions.
Presenting a vast array of creations, the gemothèque will bring together an incredible selection of different species and varieties of gems, treated stones, synthetic materials, and cut and raw stones. Visitors will be able to interact with the stones, which will also be available to students and researchers. In many ways, a living celebration and representation of L'École's collection, the gemothèque is the culmination of acquisitions that have taken place over many decades.
You can learn more about L'École and its gemothèque at www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. And now, here's Spencer and Saeed.
Saeed, welcome to Time Sensitive.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
So you begin your new book of poetry, Alive at the End of the World, with the sentence, "The end of the world was mistaken for just another midday massacre in America." I wanted to start there. These poems were born in the pandemic. It's a heavy but hopeful collection. Tell me about the time in which you wrote it, and now that it's out, how you're thinking about this particular period of time that you spent writing it.
Sure. Oh gosh, there's so much to that. I will say, as was the case for, many of us in our different personal iterations, I live alone with my dog. So for me, early in the pandemic in particular, when we were really responsibly isolating, of course, I had a lot of time. I had a lot of time to think, and I was lonely. And then all of a sudden, it began to feel like my apartment in Columbus, Ohio, where I live, was suddenly crowded with ghosts, with histories, with griefs. It was like in that isolation, in the way things kind of slowed down. It wasn't like, oh, I have dinner plans to, no dinner plans, no outings, no going to the museum, no going to the club. So what fills that time? Memory, grief, all the things you wish you could be doing, all the things that suddenly you have the bandwidth to pay attention to and notice. I think I was bewildered by that experience. I was like, if there's a police shooting anywhere in the United States, I seem to know about it. Like, I was just like tuned in. At first, I was like, I think of myself as an observer of culture. So at first it was, oh, this is interesting. And then that was like week 1 of the pandemic. And I was like, oh no, this isn't fun anymore. So I think in a way you see this book, me kind of clawing my way out of that panic. And the only way I know how to do that is to address and to acknowledge what's going on, not to run away from it. Yeah.
It almost feels, and we'll touch on this because I think there's a lot of memoir quality to this.
Yes.
But it almost feels like each poem's a form of marking time.
Mm-hmm.
And, you have deleted voice message, hey, Robin, it's me, Whitney, which has the line, I keep waking up a new color of lonely.
Right.
Or A Spell to Banish Grief, which was inspired from this depressive episode you had in January 2021. Could you talk about that sort of time marking element to these poems?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, and there's a line at one point where I make a joke in the book, like, did I just trick myself into writing another memoir? Which I've always said, I'm never going to write another one. The book functions a bit as like a follow-up to my memoir, like the afterlife of publishing a book of personal experiences. What does that feel like? What is that like after the events and the audiences go away? But also, yeah, I think it's a bit of a time capsule. And I've always been interested in, I've had this ambition to honor the fact that I believe Black queer people can be our historians. They can be at the center of culture. They can be the people who write the great American novel or whatever. And so, yeah, I mean, so it's both like a personal time capsule, but also it's me personally acknowledging the fact that I think my lens on the last few years is pretty insightful, to be honest,
Well, and this period for you personally marked the 10th anniversary of your mother's death.
Yeah.
And there's a poem in the collection called Saeed, How Dare You Make Your Mother into a Prelude, that gets to your grieving in this just potent, I would say profound way. And I was hoping you might read that here.
Of course.
Drop the listeners
mic,
right
drop
in.
the mic. Yeah, let's go there. And there's so much with this to talk about, even just the title, right? Saeed, how dare you make your mother into a prelude? And then night neons itself inside me, and I begin missing you in loud, new ways. The sky burns itself bright, then bruises black. Things fall from the sky, and those things might be water, but could just as well be boys, or bombs, or billionaires, or birds. Honestly, between your death and me, it doesn't matter. Or I don't know. Or I wasn't looking, or I couldn't see because I've made a home out of how much I miss you. And there's no one here to tell me I should leave. Alone and night neoned, I write, read, drink, drug, grieve, and all America keeps teaching me is that there are so many ways to die in America. Which, frankly, is quite confusing because this country killed you a decade ago. And I'm still writing, reading, drinking, drugging, grieving, binging, blacking out in the cozy, claustrophobic home I've made out of how very, very much I miss you. And the sky keeps throwing down consequences and corrections and histories and nations. I mean, come on. Who can blame me for not wanting to go back outside? You? A whole decade ghosted? Grounded and ground down into unreliable memories, dollar word metaphors? No, not you. Mother as mortar and pestle. Mother as son mangling meaning out of his mother's misfortune. Mother as second draft, sorry. But it's awfully true. You are prelude. And your progeny, loud and unrelenting in your epilogue, somehow has to live on as your last sentence, uncompleted.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So grief is in many ways at the heart of this book. And it's sort of a deep dive into, as I read it, both personal grief and collective grief, what we were all kind of going through. Could you share in terms of this past decade what you've learned about the grieving process and about time, and particularly in the context of this poem, which was written in this very visceral moment?
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Grief is one of the most humanizing experiences I've ever had. I'm more human now than I was before I had this relationship with grief, because it's so complicated and colorful. I mean, its twin is love, right? So you're in deep pain. You're in both like acute, when the loss happens, the week of the funeral, those initial months, that first year, acute distress. And it's bewildering. I mean, I would wake up with like dried tear streaks on my face. And I was like, what's going on? And then I would remember, you know what I mean? Or all of a sudden, I would have moments when I would realize things I would never get to do with my mother again. You know what I mean? So it's the acute, it's like, it's just really overwhelming. And it's like you feel your brain, your emotional capacity for your understanding of relationships and connections. It's just like, oh my gosh, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, fuck. It's just so bad. And then, 10 years later, it's not acute, it's changed, but you have this different relationship. And so with time, you come to realize that pain is twinned with love. The distress exists in direct proportion to how much you loved and laughed and enjoyed, enraged, whatever, with whoever you've lost. And so 10 years in, I think, I found myself entering this phase of still missing her, my mother, being confused, I think, by how intense the relationship still was. And part of that's maybe masculinity. It is masculinity. I also think it's our culture. Capitalism insists that we move on. Keep going. You don't have time to reflect. You don't have time to
9/11.
Yeah.
Rebuild.
I mean, you even hear, President Biden being like, the pandemic's over. And it's like 400 people are dying a day from COVID. It's not over. It might be different. And I'm okay with acknowledging that. But you just see people kind of like a hand on your back kind of pushing you forward. That's what the invisible hand is doing, And so I remember, again, everything for me personally stops. I'm just home. I'm not getting to be out and having conversations and being in the art spaces that help me process and live through experiences. I'm just sitting home, in the home I made out of how much I miss you. And woof, that was rough. But for it to happen then during the pandemic, I think it positioned me to have, I don't know, maybe a different resonance. It was almost like there was like a frequency that I could hear. Grief had allowed me to access like some other sound waves that I was picking up on. And, I would think about the fact that my mother was a Black woman with like a lifelong heart disease that, she had run-ins on and off, and it eventually caught up with her far too soon in her 50s. And thinking about like heart disease acutely impacts Black women in this country. Like it is a different kind of epidemic that isn't acknowledged. And that she was a Black woman who worked at an airport in the state of Georgia with heart disease. And I was like, oh, wow, I miss her so much. And of course, that means you're like, I wish she was still here. And I was like, do you? Would you want your mother to be alive to experience this pandemic? You don't, because you know exactly what would probably happen statistically, And so out of that like crucible of my kind of honest desires kind of colliding with like, well, let's be logical. Like, let's game this out. Whoa. And so suddenly that's why you see in the book, and particularly in this poem, the personal and the collective all coming together. And so you have me both kind of nodding toward billionaires and capitalism and everything else that's going on, but also this very personal grief that I'm still reckoning with.
There's this other really cutting 2-line poem, Okay, One More Story.
Right.
Just says, you died and a decade passed, then one morning, everyone started dying.
Yeah. Isn't that it? I mean, it's, you'll notice I laugh a lot. I have, because I am a pretty joyful, humorous person, but also I realized, again, like the afterlife of grief, I was like, oh, you do kind of have to begin to laugh at how grief and loss, like this loss that we're all, it humbles you, and you're kind of like, you kind of have to shrug your shoulders and go, oh, okay. All right. I have far less control than I thought. And it seems like the more I learn, the less control I actually have, and so you kind of have to just acknowledge that.
This afterlife idea reminds me a lot of Saadia Hartman's work.
Yes,
and I talked to Claudia Rankine about that on this podcast, the idea of the afterlife of slavery.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, and Saadia Hartman, and what was her most recent book? Wayward Lives, I believe. Yes, very important. And I think you also see that kind of functioning in the book too. I'm writing also about historical grief, generational trauma. I've done some research into some of my ancestors and seen their names on a plantation's inventory between cows and jars of molasses. And then there are the names of some of my ancestors. That is a grief. That is a loss. And I think Saadia Hartman and Claudia Rankine in different ways, right, have really illuminated how it's not just microaggressions, it's these histories and these generational experiences, and what we aren't able to process stays in us and thus is passed on. It's passed on through our interactions. It's passed on through our progeny, our legacy. It's passed on by the dysfunction we create in our families and communities and the ripple effect of that. So I think you also see in this book me acknowledging this sense of, gosh, it's all catching up with us at the same time.
And you mentioned humor. Humor does come into this process. I'm thinking here of your poem, The Dead Dozens. There's a stanza in it where you write, "You love your mama so much, Freud came back from the dead just to study your sorry ass."
It's a good joke if it still makes me laugh.
It's funny. And by the way, that poem's not a funny poem.
It's
but
not
that stanza is actually funny.
Pretty funny. Yeah. I mean, so humor is an important artistic tradition that I draw from, like the blues. I mean, you see blues, and that's why repetition is very much a part of this book. And because that's kind of what blues is. It's this, I think, acknowledgement of not only are things bad, it's things are piling up. It's the repetition of the grievances that's really getting us to that last beat. And I think The Dozens is another excellent example of a Black artistic tradition. And, I remember on the playground as a kid, it was just yo mama jokes. And then I'm working on this book and trying to color all of the different shades of grief. Because I think, Americans, our culture, we're not good at grief. We don't talk about it very much. And I think when we tend to talk about it, it tends to be in the acute phase. And, and that's kind of where it stays. The really sad, oh, what happened? What happened to her? Those stories are important, but I'm interested in what comes later when everybody goes away and everyone's not calling on you constantly to check on you. What happens when it just becomes an invisible but persistent part of your human experience? And yeah, I think those moments where you feel like a sorry ass, when you feel like you're whining, when you're irritated. I mean, there would be times, where I would, at times, as I mentioned, embarrassed by my grief. Sometimes you're angry. And this is, again, takes us back to the collective, but part of how so many people deal with our horrible healthcare system in this country is that they don't acknowledge their pain. They don't acknowledge their own health because they know they can't afford the help they get. They don't want their loved ones to worry about it. And that was certainly the case with my mother, and so there would be moments where I would just be so angry. And then you realize, oh, it's a different kind of haunting. It's a different kind of, so I think in the poem, you see me kind of trying to talk back in a way. And it's both in direct address to my mother and to that rage, but I also think you're seeing me maybe speaking out and this is what grief does. This is what loss does.
Your mother was a Buddhist and raised you to practice Nichiren Buddhism?
Nichiren Buddhism. Mm-hmm.
Did certain Buddhist teachings help or guide you through the grieving process?
Yes. I mean, understanding that everything is connected, that every cause has an effect. Nothing ever just goes away. Nothing truly disappears. Energy is converted, Sure, that translates into my understanding that, like, I have a present tense relationship with my mother. It's changed. I told someone the other day, I was like, it's the longest long distance relationship maybe I've ever been in, but it's still there. I mean, it's like, I get good news, like something really cool I'm going to get to do later today. And I'm so excited. And you have that moment, you're like, oh, let me go text her. Damn. You know what I mean? Like, she's still a part of my life. There's still a back and forth. And I think Nichiren Buddhism's understanding of how we exist in connection, both with seen and unseen, made sense. And then also, like, another idea that was really important in our household, I think in terms of, like, get it, like a working class single mother raising her son, you have to be pretty, tough as a household. And so the idea of turning poison into medicine, that we can take the things that are besieging us and not just neutralize them, but maybe we can turn them into gems of wisdom or works of art or opportunities for connection. And that the thing that was hurting you or wearing you out there's the potential for it to become maybe, one of the best things that's ever happened to you. The thing is, though, Buddhism's pretty tough, which is why I think I have a different relationship. And I was already beginning to become kind of chaotically ambivalent about Buddhism and organized religion well before my mother passed away. But I don't know. I think at times when I think about poison into medicine, I was talking to my therapist once and he was like, yeah, that's good. I mean, that can be an inspiring framework if that's helpful. But he was like, but why did you have to swallow the poison in the first place? Like, I think sometimes that framework of like resiliency and don't worry, there's going to be something that comes out of this, to live is to suffer. All of that's great in terms of like giving you hope, helping you get to the next day. We need that. However, again, because it's existing within our culture, our Western capitalistic culture, I think that also can kind of turn into a move on, just move on, be tougher. We don't have time for you to wallow in the feelings. And that's a problem if you're a poet.
Definitely.
I live to wallow. But also I do think that a lot of the chaos that we're dealing with kind of as a culture, as a nation, is that we have a lot of not just pain, but I would say a lot of unacknowledged tensions, histories, confusions. And again, like if you can't acknowledge it and process it, it's going to impact how you're interacting with other people. So that's the tension I live in with those philosophies, at least now.
In your new book, there's also all these references to Black artists, a kaleidoscope of people.
Oh, I love that. Yes.
Who it quickly becomes clear have had this massive impact on you. Paul Mooney, Richard Pryor, Whitney Houston, Diane Carroll, Luther Vandross, Little Richard, Cicely Tyson, Maya Angelou, Billie Holiday, Toni Morrison. I was hoping you might speak to why you homed in on these particular artists and also what about their work was reverberating in your head.
Gosh,
I mean,
yeah.
I realize it's a broad question, though, because it's 10 people. So
yes, I brought a lot of people into
10
the
different
room,
answers.
brought a lot of people. I mean, one, it was kind of like I was saying at the beginning of this conversation. I was like, yeah, I'm alone in my apartment in this pandemic, but it sure is crowded in here, like there's a lot going on, and that is how it felt. And so again, like if the book is a time capsule, how can I represent that as art? But also I was turning to their music and their film and their jokes and their ideas to give myself hope and laughter and levity and insight, just personally, just Saeed minding his own business in his living room. I was like listening to Aretha a lot. You know what I mean? I was listening to Little Richard a lot. So that's where it started, just like a sincere, this is what I was going through. And if it's a time capsule, it makes sense to acknowledge that in the book. But also, balance in all things, I think, is so important. And so while I do want to very much acknowledge that this human era we're in is wild. I am not here to tell people like, oh, it's always been this calamitous. No, we are in an era of instability, destability, like it's bad. And I think we need to be real about that. Like even climate disaster, people talk about it like it's this, like there's an event horizon wave. I'm like, no.
It's here.
It's here.
Right here.
Ask the people of Oregon with these like very deadly, unprecedented heat waves that are melting, electric infrastructure.
Go to mangroves in northern Brazil.
Yes, talk to the people still dealing with the flooding in Pakistan. You know what I mean? Like, it's here. It's here. And then also, to think about police violence and state violence. I mean, I was sitting in a cafe before coming here, and next thing I know, I'm watching a video of a kid being brutalized by like a school officer, totally unnecessarily. And it's just like, damn, I was just trying to eat my lunch, So I want to acknowledge what we're going through and that much of it does feel unprecedented. However, I think I was able to access some needed humility by learning more about the lives of these artists who I very much admire and seeing, identifying, I think you realize like these are their everyday apocalypses. Either the microaggressions that Paul Mooney is dealing with while working on Saturday Night Live with Richard Pryor in 1975, or someone like Diane Carroll, who I think is really interesting, elegance, the pearls, the glamour. And then she later said that while she was filming Julia, which is when that poem set, she was staying in the Beverly Hills Hotel, it made her sick. Like the role was very it wasn't her. It was like white people were writing this character, and then she was going out, and then everyone's applauding her being like the first Black woman on primetime television. And she was like, it made her feel ill to perform a role that was not authentic for her, And I was like, oh, that feels apocalyptic.
A white writer's idea of what a Black woman should be.
Exactly. And people are applauding you, and you're just like, that's mad. I was like, I bet she was taking a lot of long baths, Like, so there was something about kind of going into their lives. And though I obviously know and appreciate all of these artists, I tried to zero in on moments that I did not know about. And so that even if you don't know who Diane Carroll is, I think that dynamic, you feel it. You feel that exhaustion. You get home from work and you're just fed up, and you turn on the water in your bath and you're like, maybe I'll let it overflow. Like you just don't care anymore because you've worked so hard to keep yourself together and to be the elegant, respectable person you're supposed to be. And you just have moments where you don't want to do it. So even if you don't know who they are, in terms of their legacies and incredible careers, I hope you can just encounter them as people dealing with their own kind of moments of breakdown, their own griefs.
Let's get into your upbringing. You were born in Memphis and raised by your single mother in Lewisville, Texas. Mm-hmm. Paint a picture of Lewisville. Like, what are your strongest memories of that place now, looking back?
Well, I will say years before we moved to Lewisville, my mom and I were driving, because when we moved from Memphis to Texas, we first lived in Dallas for a couple of years, but we passed Lewisville. And Lewisville is right on I-35, the major highway, and Lewisville has a big water tower. I'm sure it's still there. And it says, Lewisville High School, home of the fighting farmers. And I remember we laughed. I swear we probably laughed for 15, we probably laughed all the way until we actually made it. It was just the fun. And there's, it's like Farmer John, like this white farmer in his overalls, pitchfork on a donkey who's like breathing smoke like it's a dragon. And we just laughed and laughed and laughed. And then years later, we moved to Lewisville, Texas, home of the Lewisville High School Fighting Farmers. It's a working class, middle class suburb just north of Dallas, Texas. It was interesting in that it's surrounded by much wider, much wealthier suburbs. So I was learning a lot about class at the time. It was like weird to like move from like Dallas, the city, you move to the suburbs for better schools. That's why my mom moved me out there. And it's true. I was like A honor roll, A honor roll, A honor roll. And then the moment I arrived in the 5th grade in Lewisville, I was needing to get tutored by teachers after school. Like you realize the difference in education. And so there was this weird like class collision, but then also, it was also pretty diverse. At least my high school was. It was like a lot of Latino kids, a lot of Black kids. And it was huge. It was a big school. We had 10-minute passing periods because it could take you that long to get from one classroom to another. There was just like a lot going on. And I don't know, kid of the 90s, had a lot of time to myself. We had like a lot of independence. I think about, like total swaths of hours that you were fine not having to account for as long as you were home in time for dinner. I mean, you see in my memoir all the trouble I get into. So I don't know. I mean, it was a good place, I think, for me to grow up in terms of like having needs met. But also, yeah, it's Texas. It is the Bible Belt. I was aware of my feelings for boys. It took me a while to like get to the language. But I mean, as soon as I was aware of the concept of attraction and just like what you just feel in your body, and you can't lie, it was always boys. There was never a doubt. And I was never in conflict about it. I was just like, well, this is terribly inconvenient. I was like, how am I going to be National Honor Society president? I'm just going to have to wait to come out until college. That's really how I was, So I don't know. It's a long way of saying, like, in some ways, I think it was great. And I'm grateful for the life my mom was able to make for me in Lewisville. However, and it's interesting now, so much is going on in the news that resonates, critical race theory, anti-Blackness, the school, like all of that is like a more intense version of what I grew up, but the seeds were there. The seeds were there. I remember some schoolmates tried to start like a gay straight student alliance, and they put up posters before school started, like, before first period, posters around just advertising that it was coming and that there would be like an initial meeting in a few weeks. These sweet little, posters made by kids. And they were down by the end of the day because the principal was like, absolutely not. In a way, Lewisville was like a quiet crucible. It was very like, everything's fine. We're all good here. Everything's cool, right? We all get along.
Yeah. Let's move on.
Let's move on. Let's move on. But then I would say, as a gay Black kid raised by a mom who was practicing Nichiren Buddhism in a community where like kids would come up to you and ask you what church your parents went to, like before they asked you what your name was, it was like, everything's fine. Everything's good. But personally, privately, I am freaking out. I am freaking out. And I think, that is where I think art and poetry and the creative writing begins to become important.
Tell me a little bit about your home life with your mom. I mean, you've written that she was always on the edge of exhaustion.
Yeah.
She also had this heart condition you mentioned. But it was sort of this like paradox because, as you've put it, she was a mother who was sick but did not appear to be.
Right.
How are you processing all of this related to your mom at a young age, but also what was the home life like?
In some ways, it was very vibrant. We laughed a lot. We loved to talk. We were both my mom and I, and on her side of the family, were known as the two talkers. No one else in our family were talkers. Everyone was like exhausted, but it was just like, like, and this is back, when families could meet you at the airport, like meet you at the gate. And I remember my grandmother like came to meet us at the airport and she was like, I heard you two talking. The moment the jetway door opened, and she was like, I thought you were at the door. It was like 5 minutes of just listening to you two talking and laughing. And I was just like amazed at how loud and how much you were like, what do you have to talk about that much, So that was part of it, and we love to talk about what was going on. We watched TV together. We talked about the news. My mom read 3 newspapers a day, and then we would talk about it. We were always kind of looking out and trying to make sense of the world together. I think that's where that observer in me comes from. But then also, I say it in the book at one point in the memoir, it was like sometimes the mood would change like weather. And then part of it is, I'm a teenager, so I'm moody too, so that's happening. But I think now in retrospect, she was dealing with stressors. That thing, you come home from work and you see that you're in a good mood, and then you see the bill that's overpaid waiting for you on the kitchen counter. And it just...
trying to keep a home together.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think you see that in the book, these silences that begin to emerge, both because I'm processing my sexuality. It's like the one thing where it's like health and gender sexuality. Those were like the 2 things that we're not good at talking. We could talk about everything else.
Right. She wasn't homophobic, but she wouldn't say the word gay.
Right. And it's so strange. I think like our culture does a number on us. So like queer kids, we like tie ourselves into knots to say like our parents weren't homophobic. We're like, she never beat me. She never kicked me. And I was like, well, that's still, like that. Okay, that's a low bar. That's a low bar. Yeah. But instead I would say homophobia manifested in our household as a silence, which is violent. I think silence can be cruel. I mean, especially when you're a young person and you have questions and emotions and don't you have a body? Don't you have a body, baby? You know what I mean? And so you're left on your own. And I think that's dangerous. We know all the trouble that young people get into and will always get into no matter what, but they certainly get into more when they're left to their own devices. I think something, to talk about grief a bit, something I grieve now and that I do get angry about is those silences denied us some really important, great conversations. And so you see me like in the book Try, like there's a moment where I want to ask her a question about boys and boyfriends because I was like having a boyfriend problem like when I was in college. And she just couldn't, she would go silent, like deer in headlights and like literally like freeze until like in total silence until I changed the subject. And it was so immature and silly of her to respond in that way, but I didn't know what to do. And so I write a letter. And I was like, look, I don't have anyone else to talk to. And you're attracted to men. I'm attracted to men. So I think there are times even now where I'm just like, damn, we should have been able to talk about this kind of stuff. It's really not that big of a deal. But yeah, that was kind of the tension that emerges in the house. And as I was working on the memoir, I began to realize that silence was almost like a second parent raising me,
Hey everyone, taking a quick break here to tell you a little bit about our Season 6 sponsor, L'École School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison, Van Cleef, and our pals. In addition to exhibitions, publications, research projects, and public events, L'École offers a range of courses led by experts across jewelry, craft, history, and the arts. Celebrating its first decade this year, L'École, which has permanent campuses in both Paris and Hong Kong, plans to open a third space in Shanghai next year, and will soon open another in Paris, which will feature a public library of more than 7,000 reference works on jewelry and gems. At its main Paris space, L'École is also opening a gemothèque, or gem library, that contains some 1,200 stones for visitors to view and even handle. This year, they'll also be presenting 6 exhibitions in Hong Kong, Tokyo, and Paris, and publishing 8 books. You can learn more about L'École and its current and upcoming offerings at www.lecolvancleefarpels.com. That's www.lecolvancleefarpels.com. And now, back to the episode. Your mother also had books around the house.
A lot of books.
Toni Morrison's Tar Baby and The Color Purple, James Baldwin's Another Country. You read these around age 12, and that opened your eyes to this sort of unbelievable, mind-altering reality of what books can do. Could you speak about these early reading encounters, the books you found around the house?
Sure. She had a magnificent bookcase that was in our living room, and she was a reader. By the time I was a teenager, she was really into like who did she love? Sue Crafton, like the Alphabet Murder Mystery series, Dean Koontz. She was always reading something. But a lot of those books she had acquired in her 20s. She briefly took a few college courses, wasn't able to finish college herself because of money issues. But I think it introduced her to some really important writers like Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, James Baldwin, Gloria Naylor. And she, kept those books. And I'm very much a Sagittarius in that I hate being recommended things. Like if I would tell people, like, if you want me to like read a book, just like leave it somewhere and let me stumble upon it and feel that I've discovered it. You know what I mean? And I don't know if she was intentional in that, but it's funny. She never talked about those damn books. She never talked about them. She just kept them in the middle of the living room. And so then, of course, I did stumble upon them and I never wanted to talk to her about it. Absolutely not. Gross. But I read every single one of those damn books and I love them. Even when I was, as you see in the book, like you see my first encounter with Toni Morrison and I'm just like this, I am baffled. I am confused. I was like, we haven't gotten to the concept of circular plots yet in sophomore English. I don't know what's happening. I was bewildered or The Color Purple. I was just like, girls, whoa, too much girl. But then I found her copy of Another Country and it's a really intense, troublesome book. It's got a lot going on, but there are bisexual characters. And I can tell you at that point in the book, did not know the word bisexual. So to be reading a book and you're like, and I'm just like, and I'm like, whoa, is this man hooking up with a man? This is incredible. I didn't even know this could happen in books. I thought this was just something you find in magazines if you're really lucky. You know what I mean? And then that man starts kissing a woman. I was like, now, wait a minute. What is going on? It truly blew my mind. It was so liberating. And I think there's something about the books that it was my own private experience. It felt like my own discovery that I was keeping to myself. It's weird, right? Like everything's twin. So on one hand, I am very frustrated at the ways in which silence forced me to have to figure things out on my own. But then also, of course, there is a thrill, there is a joy, there's even a pride to finding something on your own. So I wanted to bring that into the world of the book.
Well, I found it really interesting that in this sort of sense, you'd never really felt held by your mother. Mm-hmm. But holding this book, and you actually have a sentence in your memoir where you basically describe that you felt held by the book.
The book is holding me. Yeah. Yeah. It was intimate. I mean, it's woof, and just, I hide it's literally, I hide, and the next chapter involves like a wild episode with like porn magazines, right? But I literally treated a James Baldwin novel just as, as if it was just as scandalous.
Your mom's copy of it.
Yeah, like hid it under the pillows. Cause I was like, I'm going to get in trouble for reading this.
Well, this is a nice segue. You also went looking around this time for books about being gay at the Lewisville Public Library. Yeah. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about what you found.
Yeah, so because I loved libraries, I loved books, I always understood, and maybe again that kind of, and that's part of what's it, latchkey kids? There's a very kind of 90s thing. The only generation about this that's worse is like Gen Xers. They're like, we had to go in the woods to find our foods. Our parents was like, okay, we get it. You were independent, But it's true. Like there was like a sense of you kind of had to learn how to figure things out on your own. So I'm having these feelings. I'm reading them, just like, what's going on? And so I go to the public library. I walk over. I was there like basically every day, which then becomes much funny later in the book, right? It was just like one of my spaces, one of my public. It was like you go to the mall or you can go to the library, right, or the park or whatever. And I go hoping to get some answers. I'm too scared to ask like a librarian. Which now I'm like, oh my God, those librarians would have been like, this is the best thing that's happened to me all day. Come on, kid. Let me, I'll show you exactly where to go. But I was scared. And so I just I made my way to like the sociology section eventually. And all of the books I was able to find about, quote unquote, being gay, however you want to frame that, were pretty outdated. I was a pretty dusty collection at that point. It was books like How to Deal with Your Gay Child. And I think it was like, to me, it was like cancer diagnosis. And there were like outdated books that didn't have, information about where we were in the HIV/AIDS crisis at the time. I mean, so this is what, the late 90s, we have medications. HIV/AIDS is no longer a death sentence. Wouldn't know it from the books in that library though, and so I'm reading, I'm just like freaking out. And I feel like I've unwittingly introduced myself to a death sentence, it's awful, and again, you have all these feelings and now you're like, this is the answer and you can't go to anyone to ask follow-up questions, and so this is what I mean when I say silence abandons you, and it can be violent because obviously if we'd been able to talk about things like sexuality and our bodies and everything, I would have gone home and my mom would have said, oh, wait. Yes, HIV/AIDS is real, but just because you're gay doesn't mean you're going to get it. You can use protection. And also there are medications. It's no longer a death sentence. What are these books? Let's go get you some. It can become an opportunity for connection and hope, but that didn't happen. And so instead, I just kind of wander back home feeling, I guess, doomed.
But later you find yourself back at the library and actually end up having your first sexual encounter with a man there, which is like the most, I mean, it's crazy. There's something oddly poetic about you being in this library. Mm-hmm. And maybe you could share a little bit about, you don't have to rehash the full story, but
go to the library enough, you're going to have some firsts. You know what I mean? You're going to have some rites of passage. So yeah, I mean, This is, at the time when having a computer in the home, having internet connection was not something that everyone had. And there were times we would have dial up and then we wouldn't or whatever and stuff like that because it was too expensive. And my mom would be like, we don't need this internet thing or whatever. So then I go into the library to use the computers all the time. And of course, I'm just like a full fire horny teenager at this point, like in high school, as we all are. Because that's the thing. It's like we can ban books, we can do critical race theory, we can pull books from shelves, and you are never going to stop young people from having desire, from having questions, from just having want, and that's going to go somewhere, and they're going to have these questions whether you want to be the person to answer them or not. And so I'm just at the library just constantly trying to, and it was like, they have like parental blockers. I probably was like one of the first best hackers in America. I might be like a secret computer genius because I would just sit there all afternoon some days just trying to find my ways around the parent blockers to get to like either gay porn or just gay stuff, period. I was just like, I will figure this out. And so, yeah, I'm sitting there one afternoon at one of the computer carols, just in deep, like I'm in the Matrix or something, the gay teenage Matrix, trying to figure this out. Like I'm Neo. And I don't notice him at first, right? But someone leans over and I panic. I think it's a librarian. I'm in trouble. And I look up and it's like someone's dad, like a grown man in his 40s, with a wedding ring on. And I think I'm in trouble. And he just says like really gruffly, like, you like stuff like that? And I'm like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. Like I'm ready to jump out of my body and let my skeleton run out of the library because I don't know what's about to happen. You know what I mean? And because he literally, he looks like a proud alum of Lewisville High School, home of the fighting farmers. I'll say that, And then he was just like, I like stuff like that too. And I was like, oh my God. Like, what is that? Because I was like, you go from being like, maybe I'm about to get beat up or something, or like maybe he's gonna tell on me, like you're just going through like all the bad things that can happen, and then you're like, oh, I didn't realize that could possibly be an option too. He could also have these feelings, and so yeah, he invited me to go and meet him in the restroom, in the public restrooms, at the public library. I am so sorry, Lewisville Public Library. And we go in there and have like just a very awkward, fumbling hookup that in retrospect, to me, I think it's like very comedic and also deeply human, to be honest, because what was that guy going through? In some ways, it's like a funny, fumbling scene, but also it makes me think of like kind of how sad it is too, a bit. In that it's like, this lost, confused teenager, 14, 15 years old, who's just like desperate for someone, any version of connection, anything that looks like an opportunity to have this desire, these feelings acknowledged by anyone. It could be a TV show. It could be a drag show. It could be a person. And then here's this person, but on the other end, he was clearly closeted or subversive in some way himself. And, I don't know his life story, but I'm struck by like, what was he feeling? What was he trying to acknowledge? And then just the two of us in a bathroom stall. Ugh. I will never, like on my deathbed, I will be able to recall the particular color of the peach tiles in that restroom. I'll think about it forever because it was like the sound of like, like his belt hitting I'm just like, oh my God.
That'll be the color as the lights fade out.
It's such a vivid memory. Oh gosh.
So you mentioned the bad things, and obviously the imagination could go in a lot of places. And the backdrop of this, and I wanted to bring this up, this was around the time of the murders of James Byrd Jr. and Matthew Shepard. You wrote about both of them in your 2019 memoir, How We Fight for Our Lives, noting that by 2002, your feelings about both murders had started to swirl and converge. And I was hoping you might share a little bit about your reactions as a young boy to these murders. I know the James Byrd Jr. news you watched on the TV with your mom.
Yeah. And Matthew Shepard, seeing that kind of play out because Matthew Shepard was treated as more of a national scandal in my memory.
Yeah, the Laramie Project.
The Laramie Project, the play, and just like the trial and all of that. So, yeah, and so that's why I talk about, that my first reaction, like when I'm at that computer carol, though it's somewhat, and I believe in being complicated and having complicated nuances. So it is funny in some ways and like a silly kind of coming of age story. But then also I was genuinely scared at first. You know, the moment you feel someone lean over and you don't know. You don't know what people are going to do. And because I am in a household, we're watching the news, we're talking about it, I know what people are capable of at this point out there, right? So I had that fear, I had that terror. I think it's hard for people to fathom because technology and our access to community and the conversations we have, things have changed a lot. But there was a point when I was early teens where I sincerely believed like I was the only gay person in all of Lewisville, Texas. Because if there were other gay people, wouldn't they be talking about it, right? That just seems obvious, wouldn't they? And there's no sign of that. And so to learn about Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr., two very different people, but both were violently killed, at least in part because of their identity, just who they are. You know, that's the message I remember receiving as a teenager. Oh, just being who you are is dangerous.
It's a death wish.
It's a death wish, you know, or a death sentence. And that is terrifying, you know, and that is too much of a burden. If any child, any teenager came to me and said, you know, I'm really worried that to be trans or, you know, non-binary, Saeed, is a death wish. Come sit by me. We're going to talk. We're going to talk and we're going to laugh and we're going to process this together until you don't feel that way anymore. But unfortunately, I didn't get to have those experiences as a teenager. So in the book, yeah, you see me just kind of observing all of this, taking it in, noting the silences. I remember being grateful that, for example, a news story about Matthew Shepard comes on. It's not that my mom would say something homophobic, you know, that's what he got what he deserved or whatever. I would hear other adults around us saying it. So my mom wouldn't do that, but she would be silent. There would be like a sudden blankness. You know, I think she would very intentionally find an excuse to get up and go into the kitchen, you know, so I couldn't read the expressions on her face. There was like an abandonment that wasn't the same with James Byrd Jr. You know, it was like, that was like, we were able to share that grief. And so, yeah, you're reading all of that. And that's what, you know, like, adults, and I know I keep going back to like banning books and these conversations, but it is really important because of course young people are paying attention. Of course they are all, I mean, I think young people are some of the most observant amongst us, right? And so they're taking all of this on. And I just think for me as a teenager, Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr., there was a haunting there that I wish I hadn't taken so much of it on, you know, but I did. And those stories lived with me. And there's a reason why, you know, I continue to write about them and the fallout of those stories in different ways. Yeah.
In your 2014 collection of poems, Prelude to Bruise, there's this staggering, I think that's a very fair word to say, poem Jasper 1998 that you wrote in memory of James Byrd Jr. I was hoping we could take a moment for you to read it here.
Sure. And just for historical context, James Byrd Jr. was a Black middle-aged man living in Jasper, Texas, which was about a 4-hour drive from where we lived in Texas at the time. And it was a hot day, and he accepted a ride home from 3 white men who had a truck. And, you know, because it just was overwhelming and just the walk was so long. And they turned out to be white supremacists, and they beat him near death in a parking lot. I mean, it's just awful. And then they chained him to the back of their truck and dragged his body until his body came apart. I mean, it's like horrific on like a whole other scale of violence. You know, it's like, what are we even capable of as human beings to do that to people? But I also want to acknowledge as well that he was buried in a cemetery in Jasper and desegregated the cemetery. He was the first Black person to be buried in that part of the cemetery. And his gravestone is consistently defiled. Like very often I look up and it's like it's been like spray painted, marked over. And, you know, and so there's something for me, you know, all these years later, I'm in my mid-30s now, to think about this horror that I learned about in 1998 when I was a kid, and like to see it in that way and the way I was haunted, but also just to know as an adult, All these years later, people always want to talk about America as this nation of progress. And of course, things always get better. And I'm like, do they?
The churn, the afterlife.
Yeah, the loop, the loop that we're living in. Yeah, the afterlife of these events. So this is Jasper 1998 in memory of James Byrd Jr. 1. Go back. My throat still crowded with dirt and loose teeth, but I speak. Tongue slick with iron, but I speak in the language of sharp turns. Go back. I accept this ride. Tired, don't want to walk home. It's not far, but far enough. I accept this ride. 3 nice men, white men, a bit too nice, but I accept. No backseat driver. Smile, ride, quiet. Could have taken that last turn, but I accept these men, their sense of direction. But I live on the other side of town. Smile, ride, quiet. Another turn, I wouldn't take this road, back road, wrong way, too far. Smile with questions in my eyes. Ride, back seat, sure is better than walking. Quiet, middle of nowhere, tight-lipped white men, no other cars around, no sound. But my heart, where? Say it. Where? Louder. Where are we going? 3. Chain gang, work song, back road, my body. Chain gang, work song, back road, my body. These men play me dirty. Tell my back to sing or break. Hard-won rattle of chains dragged behind this truck, louder than what little sound is left in my throat. Pavement becomes skin-tight drum. They take my teeth for piano keys. My God, this song, one man, chain gang, playing this road. Every stick, every pebble, this road, this song. Hear me, Jasper. Hear me for miles.
Wow.
Yes. You have to acknowledge the heaviness. You have to. Yeah.
I wanted to transition here to your time in Kentucky at Western Kentucky University. And this is after you'd gotten into NYU. We're not able to go due to financial reasons, but you did get into Western Kentucky University on a debate team scholarship.
Speech and debate. Mm-hmm.
Was this when you knew you wanted to become a poet in earnest when you were in Kentucky? When was that moment? And connected to the debate team, I was wondering how you think about that too in this context of poetry, of becoming, because I imagine learning how to use language, learning how to create sort of biting lines,
right,
being able to like one up your opponent.
The competitiveness and all of that. It was very funny because I hate debating. I hate like people and like contrarians. I'm just like, go away. Oh my gosh. I hate people who want to debate just for the sake of, whatever. Like, who has that kind of time? So I've been at this point, throughout high school quietly writing. I was like writing poems in my notebook when I would pointedly not pay attention in class. And, it was like, I wasn't passing notes to girls. I was like passing poems to my girlfriends to be like, girl, read this, girl. It's good. What do you think? They'd be like, oh, this is good, I'm still in touch with some of those friends and we laugh about it. So I would say at the beginning of college, I went in just as an English major, I think with the intention of, I can't remember, the initial degree was like designed to like basically prepare me to be an English teacher if I wanted to. I mean, I like teaching. I did, and obviously I ended up becoming an English teacher at one point, right? And I love, all of that. I love education, but it was also because I couldn't imagine becoming how do you become a poet? Like what? I didn't. And this is a question of access and culture. How are books made? Editors? Books just, to me, appeared, on bookshelves, either in stores and libraries. I knew nothing else about it. So the idea of becoming a writer, what? You know what I mean? But I was like, English teacher, that's a job, that's whatever. But, it's the desire's there, the love is there. And then, speech and debate, I did all kinds of events, impromptu speaking, which is why I can speak uninterrupted for like 4 minutes without taking a breath, and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, I think what happened then is that on one hand, I'm going along, minding my business with English, being a, English major, okay, whatever. But I'm doing speech and debate. And so I'm hyper aware of language's potential, the potential of performance, of timing, audience analysis, like read the room. I'm very good at that. And I did it in high school, and that's why I got the scholarship. So, by the time I'm in college, I grew up in Texas, as you know, right? So it was like I was doing like American Legion oratorical contest, and I'd be like alone in an American Legion hall in like Bryant, Texas, Lubbock, Texas, all these like random towns. And I would have to learn how to win over a room full of old white veterans talking about government and politics. Like I would have to learn how to make that work. And that is an incredible skill. But as I mentioned, I don't like debating for the sake of debate. And I think as we see in our culture right now, everything's a proxy war, everything's one-upmanship. People aren't having a lot of good faith conversations. They're trying to outdo each other. They don't even believe in what they're talking about. And I know that because I used to do that. That's how I paid for college. So I think, I was just like aware of all of that. And then, privately having this artistic desire, and some graduates of the speech team, some alum, formed a slam poetry team. And we would go and I would see them. And of course, I was very competitive like anyone else, in this world. And I would, so I wrote some poems to perform, and I would get to the finals, but I would never win. I was never good at I was like, I don't, because slam poetry, it's a folk art. It's a very specific space. And I realized I was learning a lot from it. I think, I like to perform my poems. I like to believe I'm an engaging speaker, reader, performer, right? But that's different. And so I took as an elective a poetry workshop, initially to get better, I thought, for these poetry slams. But then in these workshops, I discovered that, yes, I wanted my poems to vibrate. I wanted there to be heat. I wanted people to go woof when they read my work. But I also wanted them to be able to exist on the page. And I love the form. I love the rigor of that kind of writing. It really delighted me. And I'm really grateful that the professor teaching that workshop, Tom Hunley, saw that I wasn't just like a normal gen ed kid just trying to get off, check off another credit for general education, that I was really into this. And he encouraged me to take another class and another. And then I changed my major. And he was like, you could publish these, it was, and I was always like, I can't. What? And then one day he came along and said, you could apply to graduate programs. And I was like, are you shitting? What? I was amazed, and oh my gosh, I'm so grateful, because if he had not said that, I'm not sure. Maybe there's another road. Maybe this is my destiny, and I would have found my way to this. Probably, right? I would like to think I found my way to poetry. Maybe not. One hopes. But yeah, it was really because someone said, can you stay after class for a second? Can we talk for a moment? Here's some more books, and that made all the difference. I think I'm a pretty confident person, but to take that leap, to be a poet, to decide to say this will be my expertise. This will be the organizing principle that everything else is built around. It's a pretty bold choice, you know what I mean? And it's worked out. Worked out. But yeah, a lot of appreciation to him for that vote of confidence.
Well, you then go to Rutgers University in Newark for your MFA, and you've described this period in which so much inside me kept roiling, half contained, like a dam waiting to burst. And the pen became a weapon for you. The page was a shield. That's your metaphor. I'm not, yeah. What did this writing time and MFA time mean to you? Was that like a period of deep craft? How do you think about it?
Oh, yeah. As I tell students and artists I mentor, when it goes well, and I had a very positive graduate experience in my MFA program, when it goes well, it's wonderful because never for the rest of your life will you be put in a situation where all you really need to do is write and read. Like, that'll never happen. You know what I mean? Like, I'm doing like 20 things on any given day. And this is my life as a full-time writer. You know, it's a real gift. It's a real gift. I was obsessive and probably really annoying. The roiling feelings, part of it is passion. Part of it is being like a first generation, and now I'm like, a first generation graduate student at that point. I feel like I'm like living on another planet from my family, from my mother, you know, at this point in my life. I'm like, I can't even begin to, you know, I at times almost feel like embarrassed to talk about school stuff because it felt so far away from, you know, what my family knew and what we were doing. And frankly, that was my arrogance. My mom was really smart. We could have talked about this stuff. She would have been okay. You know what I mean? I remember coming back home from break once and she was reading like Best American Essays. And I was like, oh, where did you? And she was like, I got it at the bookstore. Like, you know, like it's not.
So I walked into Barnes
yeah,
and
it's just
Noble.
like, it's not like these books are kept at Fort Knox, you know, like it's, yeah, other people also read Best American, you know, and I needed that, like, you know, that humbling, but, oh, it was wonderful. You know, I just dived in and you learn a lot of what you don't like. You learn a lot of but you need to do that. You know, like, I think it's really important as an emerging artist to just go all in and expose yourself to as much as possible. I loved Newark was a wonderful community that I knew nothing about when I arrived. And so I was learning so much about the city of Newark, its history, the uprisings in the 60s was incredible. And then, yeah, I would get on the path and then I'm in New York. Now I couldn't believe it. I was like, I am sitting in 92nd Street Y and Toni Morrison is right there. I got tickets like it was going to see Beyonce. I was like, I remember, I'll never forget, I bought 4 tickets immediately. For the first time I could see Toni Morrison. I didn't even ask who would go with me. You know, I was like, we'll figure it out later. You know what I mean? I was like, gotta get these. You know, I was just so excited to have access, to have time. People who grow up with privilege and access to institutions, to mentors, to the networking and stuff, you have no idea how mysterious and bewildering the inner workings of art and writing and publishing are to those of us who don't have that access, you know? And this is a great example. One of my workshop, I won't name names, but one of my workshop professors who was a very nice person. You know I'm about to say something bitchy if I say they're a very nice person. Had just had a poem while we were in workshop published that week in The New Yorker. Which I'm proud to say, you know, I've now been published in The New Yorker several times. So it's very cool, right? Yeah, feeling good. Love that. Shout out to Kevin Young, wonderful person, wonderful editor. And so one of my workshop classmates asked this professor, like, oh, can you just talk to us about getting published? Like, how did you get published in The New Yorker? And this professor, who was a little older, was like, oh, well, you know, the former editor of The New Yorker was kind of like my godfather. He was my father's best friend, and he would come around, you know, ever since I was a little girl. And so I was just like, what? You know, like one, what useless information, but also two, actually very useful in terms of understanding how other people operate, and that there's these like echelons of power that you're like, he's just like over at your house for dinner regularly. Like, what? You know? So it was really great. It was an incredible education. But also I think my intensity was from this sense of like outsider consciousness, self-consciousness, and the sense that's like, okay, if I'm going to be a poet, I've got to do it. Like, there's no option but to win, right? Anything less than success that would allow me to break through, I felt, and was probably be accurate, would be total failure. Because at that point I was like, great, 2 degrees in poetry. I'm a Black gay man in America from a working class family. You know, at that point, my mom's health is touch and go. You know, she's needing help for like car bill. You know, it was like, this has to work. This has to work. And so I wrote like my life depended on it.
And about a year after graduating from Rutgers, you got the call that your mom was in the ICU, and How We Fight for Our Lives ends with you writing about your time together with her there. As a reader, time practically slows down on these pages.
Yeah, like unspools.
And you write so beautifully and heartbreakingly about time. You write about how, quote, time held her brain hostage for each of those minutes, and how, quote, the hospital visits usually twice a day seemed to bend time. Would it always be this way, you write? Time cascading and crashing in on itself, each memory pushing me back toward the beginning of my grief. I didn't know if I could take it. How do you think about this time with her in the ICU now, these final days?
Yeah. Oh gosh. I mean, I want to hug everyone in that room. I tried to be very deliberate when I was writing that part of the book about my family members who were there too. And I tried to be very intentional of like when to turn the gaze on them because, they didn't ask me to write this book. And so I wanted to respect their privacy. But of course, there were many of us that were in that room.
Your uncle was this sort of beacon.
Yeah, yeah. And God, it's just so hard. You're in this liminal space and you're hoping, but it's just, and it's scary. I mean, and I write about, moments when she had basically 2 like minor seizures, I guess, because it's like, on TV and movies, coma, you just like, it just seems like a totally kind of peaceful kind of and it's not necessarily like that.
You're running out of the room. Your legs are falling out.
Yeah, like doctors are running and I run out. Yeah, and I almost like collapse at one point just fully. I mean, it was just a surreal experience and nothing had prepared me for that kind of experience. So I have deep compassion for that Saeed and for my family members because my mother was the light of our family. She was the one that brought us together. She was the one who could get us laughing and kind of get us over ourselves. She would warm us up. Until she came in, we were all just kind of icy side. And then she would warm the room up. And me too, myself included, And I felt immediately, even just, when before I knew she was going to die. But I'm just thinking like, okay, even best case scenario at this point, based on the brain trauma, my mom, will never be the same. I remember immediately grieving the loss, grieving the understanding that warmth was never going to be the same, or I would have to try to step into it. And I didn't know how to. Now, when I look back, particularly, where we are in 2022, I have humility. I'm humbled that we were able to spend time with her. That last day, when it's finally time to say those last goodbyes and, everyone was able to travel to the hospital from wherever we needed, to come from. Everyone was able to be there, which is very scary. You're kind of like, you need to get here now. You need to get whatever flight, like let's, all of that, the logistics, and it's so stressful and scary. But everyone was able to make it. We were all able to kind of spend time with her, say goodbye in our own ways. Or, I remember I have a grandmother's cousin, my Aunt Claudette, took us all out to get our nails done one day, and we had champagne. There were these moments of laughter, and we were able to kind of do everything that I think I would hope every family going through a loss like that, I would wish for every family to get to have that week together. It was awful, but we were able to be together and to have those moments, and and in that sense not have like regrets. And so to be in the middle of this pandemic and to think about people having to say goodbye to their loved ones via phone or looking at iPads, or loved ones just needing to go to the hospital and you have to go by yourself. That, oh my gosh, I can't even fathom, because it's so difficult no matter what, right? But these rituals, these moments, being able to kind of initiate slowly, gently, the bereavement process, because, hey, Saeed, you don't know it, but you're about to go on like a 10-year journey. This is the beginning of a very long, arduous journey. So to be able to have people and resources to like graciously ease into that new reality, oh, I have such gratitude that I was able to, because you see, it's not easy. You see me like really struggling in the months after my mom's passing, and a shocker if you read Alive at the End of the World, still struggling.
Yeah,
you know?
isolated at home.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what a decade, though.
What a decade.
In 2013, you win a Pushcart Prize for poetry. In 2014, your first book of poems comes out. You have this incredible career and journey beyond poetry in the newsroom at BuzzFeed, where you eventually become the executive editor of the Culture Desk. You write powerful, necessary essays there. One of my favorites is Self-Portrait of the Artist as an Ungrateful Black Writer.
Thank you.
In 2019, How We Fight for Our Lives comes out, wins the Kirkus Prize. I mean, during this time, you're in New York City.
Yeah.
And incredibly productive. What do you make of this productivity? Was all this creative output a way of dealing with or healing from your grief? Did you find catharsis in it? How do you think about it?
I always tell people, I'm like, writing is writing, therapy is therapy. It's like definitely like the first poem I read during this conversation, like Saeed, how do you make your mother into a prelude? It's not like I finished that and I was like, well, I feel great. It's like I finished it and I was like, okay, time to revise it. I think, I am incredibly proud of this and I haven't thought of it, in that framework. So even just to hear you lay it out in that way, it's like, oh, wow, okay. I think it's a bit kind of like what I was saying, like as a graduate student, where I was like, this has to work. This has to work. And then I also feel it has to have been worth it. These experiences, these people, these histories that have made me possible, that have made my life, who I am to you, to readers, possible, it has to mean something. You know what I mean? Frank B. Walderson, who I mention a bit throughout Alive at the End of the World, his book Afro-Pessimism, he says at one point basically that he was like, he says like, what really scares me, what I fear more than anything as a Black person in America is a meaningless death. I'm walking down the street and a cop in a bad mood or whatever happens, and then I'm dead because of whatever, and it's meaningless. It doesn't even make people just move on because everything's going on around you. That's a really scary thought. And so I think it's like all of these experiences, what happened to my mother, and not just what happened to my mother, but who my mother was. She was such an incredible person. So it was really important to me with the memoir to create a testament to her. You can't meet her, you can't engage with her, but I hope in some sense of reading the book, you're like, Carol Sweet Jones was an extraordinary person who once lived here with us. And I'm so grateful that her son at least gave me the opportunity to learn about her, And so I just, and also, it's a joy. I love writing. I enjoy writing. I enjoy, the rigor of language and image and sound. It delights me. So it's not all just like a heavy responsibility, but I just think if you find yourself in a situation where you have the opportunity to turn something you've experienced, survived, learned into something meaningful for someone else, do it. Why wouldn't you? Life is so hard. This life thing is quite difficult, if you may not know. And one of the best things we can do for each other is to offer forth our experiences in the best way we can. You know what I mean? Like if I could record the Renaissance album, obviously I would, but I'm not Beyonce. I can't do that. But I can do this. And for as long as I can, I'm going to keep trying, because I think out of my joy and the intensity of that passion, I hope that I'm able to inspire people to work towards theirs.
Saeed, thank you so much for coming in today. I really love this conversation.
Thank you for this conversation and like the careful, thoughtful reading. You went deep. You went into the archive. So thank you.
Extra thanks to our Season 6 sponsor, L'École School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison Van Cleef & Arpels. A unique place for learning, L'École welcomes the general public to the world of jewelry through courses, conferences, exhibitions, videos, and book publications. You can find out more about L'École at www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.lecolevancleefarpels.com. And thank you for listening. You can find more episodes of Time Sensitive on our website, timesensitive.fm, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can listen to our other podcasts at a distance by heading to atadistancepodcast.com. You can follow us on Instagram at slowdown.tv. And if you like our programs, please be sure to subscribe and leave comments. Our theme music was composed by Billy Martin. This episode was produced by Ramon Broza, Emily Zhang, and Johnny Simon.